Wes Montgomery did not go to rock and roll shows. That was not modesty. That was not snobbery exactly. It was simply the way a man felt when he had spent 30 years learning a language and considered other languages a distraction from fluency. Jazz was the language. The guitar was the instrument. And Wes Montgomery had built something so precise, so personal, so entirely his own inside, that language that there was very little room left in his attention for anything else. He played with his thumb, not a pick, not a finger, his thumb. It gave his notes a softness that no one else could replicate, a roundness that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than technique. He had invented the octave solo, a way of doubling every note at the interval of an octave to create a sound that was simultaneously intimate and orchestral. Miles Davis called him the greatest guitarist alive. John Coltrane sought his company. Critics ran out of adjectives by the third paragraph of every review. At 45 years old in the autumn of 1967, Wes Montgomery was at the peak of his career. Not the wild, hungry peak of a young man trying to prove something, the settled, unhurried peak of someone who had already proven everything and was now simply living inside the music, one night at a time. He did not go to rock and roll shows until the night he did. It was a Tuesday in November, and the city was cold the way London gets cold. Not dramatically, but relentlessly, seeping through coats and scarves and the thin walls of every building that was not quite designed for the temperature it was being asked to hold. Wes was in town for a week of sessions, recording with a British rhythm section that his label had arranged, and he had spent most of his evenings in the small flat they'd put him in, drinking tea, watching the rain, working through chord progressions on an unplugged guitar. His friend that week was a session bassist named Colin, a soft-spoken man who knew everyone in London's music scene and had the rare gift of being liked by musicians from completely different worlds. Colin had mentioned the show twice. The third time, he did not mention it as a show at all. "There's someone playing tonight," Colin said. "I'd like to know what you think." He did not say the name. He knew if he said the name, Wes would politely decline. The venue was in Soho, a club that held maybe 200 people and smelled of cigarette smoke and old wood, and the specific kind of anticipation that only certain rooms ever learn to hold. They arrived early enough to find a spot near the back, standing, which Wes preferred. He liked to see the whole room. He liked to watch an audience before he decided whether an audience deserved his attention. The opening act finished. The crowd shifted and thickened, and then from the side of the stage, a figure walked out carrying a white Stratocaster. Wes looked at Colin. Colin looked at the stage. The name Jimi Hendrix had reached Wes Montgomery the way certain names reach men who are not looking for them. Sideways, through other people's conversations, mentioned in passing as something loud and American and young. Wes had heard Purple Haze once on a taxi radio and found it interesting in the way a classical musician might find a thunderstorm interesting, as a natural phenomenon, not as a model for behavior. He had not sought out more. What he had formed, without quite realizing it, was an image. The image was of a performer. Someone who used volume and spectacle the way a stage magician used scarves and mirrors, to produce an effect that depended on the audience not looking too closely. He was not prepared for what happened when the music started. Jimi Hendrix did not open with theatrics that night. He opened with a single note, one note bent slow, held long, vibrating at the edge of its own decay. The kind of note that jazz musicians spend years learning to produce, not through technique alone, but through the willingness to let silence exist inside a sound. It lasted 4 seconds, maybe 5. The room was already quiet before it ended. Wes Montgomery shifted his weight. Something in his body recognized something in that note before his mind caught up with what it was recognizing. The song was a blues, not a 12-bar exercise, not a demonstration, an actual blues, the kind that carries geography inside it, the Mississippi Delta, and the back porch and all the decades between then and this room in Soho in 1967. Jimmy played it slowly. He played it like he had nowhere else to be, which is the hardest thing to fake and the easiest thing to sense when it is real. His thumb worked the low strings with a weight that Wes understood immediately, instinctively. That is how you get that sound, he thought. That is where that comes from. Jimmy was playing with his thumb, not exactly as Wes played. The angle was different, the attack was different, the whole physical approach was different, but the intention was the same. The intention was to make the guitar sound like a voice, and not just any voice, a voice that had something to say that could not be said with words. Wes stopped thinking about technique. That was how he knew something real was happening. When technique stopped being the thing you looked at and became the thing you saw through, the way a window becomes invisible once you are fully focused on what is outside it. Jimmy was playing a melody in the middle register, and underneath it, with his thumb, he was sustaining bass notes that responded to the melody the way one person in a conversation responds to another. Not in unison, not in echo, but in genuine reply. Two voices, one instrument, one person. The conversation was happening in real time, and both sides of the conversation were listening to each other. The room was very quiet. Wes Montgomery had heard a lot of guitar players. He had played alongside some of the most technically advanced musicians in the world, sat in rooms with men whose relationship with their instruments bordered on something that did not have a secular name. He knew what it felt like to be in the presence of genuine mastery. This was that feeling. He did not move for the duration of the song. He stood with his arms folded, weight on his back foot, completely still. Colin, standing beside him, glanced over twice and then stopped glancing. He understood that whatever was happening for Wes needed to happen without interruption. The solo, when it came, was not loud. That was the thing that stayed with everyone who described that night. In the years after, when the story had passed through enough hands to become something close to legend, people expected loud. Jimmy gave them something that was the opposite of loud. Something so specific, so interior, that leaning in felt like the only appropriate response. He played a single phrase. Then he let it go. Then he played the space where the phrase had been, as if he were tracing its outline, reminding the room of what had just been there. Then he answered it from 3 frets lower, with something that inverted the phrase, turned it upside down and examined its underside, and found something there that the original phrase hadn't known about itself. Wes had done this, not in this style, not with this sound, not in this language, but the process, the way you ask a melodic idea, a question, wait for the answer, then ask a harder question, that was something he had spent his life practicing. He had spent his life practicing it, and this person, this young man with the white Stratocaster and the flamboyant clothes and the name that radio DJs said like it was a spectacle, was doing it as naturally as breathing. He was 50 years ahead of where he had any right to be. When the song ended, the room came back. Noise returned, applause, the clink of glasses, the exhale of 200 people who had briefly forgotten to breathe. Wes unfolded his arms. He did not applaud, not because he was unmoved, but because his hands seemed to have forgotten what applauding was for. Colin was watching him. "Well?" he said after a moment. Wes did not answer immediately. He looked at the stage where Jimmy was adjusting a tuning peg with the casual focus of someone doing a small domestic task, apparently unaware of or indifferent to what he had just done to the room. "He plays with his thumb," Wes finally said. Colin waited. "On the low strings. He uses his thumb the way I use my thumb." He paused. "But it doesn't sound like me." "No," Colin said. "It doesn't." "It's the same idea," Wes said, more quietly now, as if he were working something out and did not fully need an audience for the working. "Same idea, completely different conclusion." He looked at the stage again. "How old is he?" 24. Wes was quiet for a long moment. Around them the room moved and murmured, but he was somewhere else, somewhere that only the music had taken him, somewhere that was still ringing. "He's going to do things with a guitar," Wes said, "that I haven't thought of yet." They did not meet that night. Wes considered it, stood near the stage door for a few minutes after the set, then decided against it. He wasn't sure what he would say. He wasn't sure what the right conversation was between two people who had been, without either of them knowing it, thinking about the same problem from opposite ends. He went back to the flat. He sat with his guitar in the dark for a while, not playing, just holding it. His wife, back in Indianapolis, would have recognized that posture. It meant he was listening to something that wasn't in the room. In the morning, he called the studio and pushed the session by 2 hours. He needed the morning for himself. He died in June of 1968, 7 months later, a heart attack at 45. It was the kind of death that the people who loved him had feared without ever quite articulating the fear. He had always carried himself with the particular stillness of someone who burned a great deal of energy in a place where it didn't show. Jimi Hendrix was on tour in America when he heard the news. He did not make a public statement. He was not asked to. Wes Montgomery and Jimi Hendrix were not supposed to have been connected in the world's understanding of music and its categories. But Colin, the bassist, told the story in an interview years later. A small magazine, 1974, the kind that folded after 6 issues. He told it simply and without decoration, the Tuesday night, the club, the single note, the way Wes had gone still, what he had said at the end. He's going to do things with a guitar that I haven't thought of yet. The interviewer asked if Wes had said anything else. Colin thought about it for a moment. He said, "That's what it's supposed to sound like. I've been getting close, but that's what it's supposed to sound like." There is a particular kind of recognition that only happens between people who are working on the same problem. It is not admiration exactly, though admiration is part of it. It is not envy, though that might be part of it too. It is the feeling of seeing your own work reflected in someone else's and understanding, for the first time, what your work has been trying to become. Wes Montgomery heard Jimi Hendrix play one song in a room in Soho and recognized something he had been reaching toward for 30 years. He recognized it not because Jimi was playing his music. Jimi was not playing anything like his music. But because Jimi was asking the guitar the same questions, in a different accent, at a different volume, with a different set of answers. They never spoke. They never played together. They never had the conversation that the music, that Tuesday Night had suggested was possible. Jimi died in September 1970. Wes had been gone for 2 years already. What remains is the music, and the story that Colin told to a small magazine that folded after 6 issues, that passed from musician to musician through the decades the way the real stories always travel. Quietly, without amplification, finding the people who needed to hear it. He's going to do things with a guitar that I haven't thought of yet. He did.